Okay, good afternoon. I think we probably still have a few people coming in, but we'll go ahead and get started. We've got a pretty full agenda for the meeting today. So good afternoon, and thank you for coming to today's Clean Waters Initiative workshop, efforts to improve the region's water quality. Before we get started, I have a few Zoom etiquette reminders for everybody. So you just heard the meeting is being recorded today, and your microphones are muted and cameras are turned off. If you've got questions, we're going to want to hold those till the end of each presenter's section, just because we're on a pretty tight schedule. So if you would use your chat function or the reactions button to raise your hand and ask to be unmuted, you can go ahead and ask your question. If you're using or you're calling in on your phone, you can use the *9 to raise your hand to do that same thing. And then, of course, the access to chat or raise your hand function on your handheld device is using those 3 dots at the bottom of the screen. And you can raise your hand or use the chat feature with that. So that's just a little bit of a reminder on Zoom. I think we're all gotten pretty good at it during this time, but it never hurts to have a reminder. And like I said, we'll have a few minutes at the end of each presentation for questions, and I'm going to do my best to keep us on time today as we're going forward. If your questions that you have that don't get answered during that time, please take an opportunity to ask questions in the breakout sections at the end of our presentations today. You can do that, and then I'd encourage you to get in touch with any of our presenters or the speakers today after the workshop if you need any further information or want to find out how to be further involved. So my name is, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Todd Running. I'm the Water Resources Manager at H-GAC, and I wanted to just take a moment at the beginning of today's session to give you a quick overview of what we're going to be discussing today and what our speakers are going to be talking about. So could I have the next slide, please, Stephen? I wanted to start off with the backbone of the water quality work and the water quality improvement process that we have at H-GAC, and that really comes down to our coordinated monitoring program, which is done through the Clean Rivers program. In our area, we've got over 400 water quality monitoring stations. We coordinate with 8 local partners to collect data, and that's all approved by a quality assurance project plan, and all of our laboratories are accredited by NELAB. So we have really good confidence in the data that's been collected. Between 60 and 70% of all monitoring data, ambient water quality monitoring data, is collected through the Clean Rivers program. And so all this data is provided to the TCEQ and is used in assessments to determine if waterways are meeting their standards. And if those standards are not being met, actions such as the development of total maximum daily load I plans, implementation plans, or watershed protection plans need to be developed. Next slide, please, Stephen. So here's a map that includes the watershed-based plans in our area. They include both total maximum daily load implementation plans and watershed protection plans. All of these plans are developed by local stakeholders and are voluntary in nature, and many of the plans that you see in the areas covered are facilitated by H-GAC, and a good deal of those plans are facilitated by other local partners. So you can see we've got a broad array of watershed-based plans that are taking place in our region, and they're in various stages of development. But this is kind of gives you an indication of where they're all located. Of course, the most important part of developing these plans is implementation. What is going to be done to actually reduce the pollutants of concern in a watershed? H-GAC and other local partners have developed many resources for local entities and individuals to use to reduce pollution, such as septic system outreach and education, septic system repair and replacement, non-point source education, and that's getting out and talking with folks and doing training sessions, urban forestry and green infrastructure, and targeted monitoring to help pinpoint sources of bacteria pollution in our area. And so we're going to cover all of those today. Take a look at the resources that H-GAC has implemented and the tools that are available for local entities and individuals to use. And so here's our agenda for the day. You can kind of see we're on about a 15-minute schedule for each of our speakers, and then we'll be getting into breakout sessions at the end of the program. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian Sims, who is one of our senior planners, and he's going to talk about on-site sewage facility outreach and education. Brian?
Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Sims, and I'm a senior planner at H-GAC. Today, as Todd mentioned, we're going to be talking about our outreach and education in regards to the on-site sewage facilities, also known as septic systems. So just a brief introduction as to what an on-site sewage facility is. Most people are familiar with a conventional wastewater sanitary sewer collection system where water is taken from the site and collected and sent to a remote wastewater treatment plant where things are treated off site. With an on-site sewage facility, they are at the property where the wastewater is generated, and they can treat up to 5,000 gallons per day of residential or commercial wastewater there on site. These types of systems are pretty widespread throughout the region. They're utilized primarily in areas where connection to a residential sanitary sewer collection system is not available, although a lot of them were put in, several decades ago, and there are now treatment facilities within the area, but pockets with on-site sewage facilities. When I mention on-site sewage facilities, this is referring to both conventional septic systems and aerobic treatment units, just so you're aware. But I do want to make clear that these systems, they're very effective and provide appropriate wastewater treatment on the condition that they're properly designed, installed, operated, and maintained. As long as those conditions are met, these types of systems are really, really good at providing appropriate wastewater treatment. Next slide. So these systems, they treat the sewage that is generated on site by the property, and they remove contaminants before they reach the groundwater or surface water. This includes organic materials, nutrients such as phosphorus and nitrogen, as well as pathogens such as bacteria, viruses, and parasites can all be treated with these types of systems. Next slide. What happens when these systems fail, however? These can cause serious water quality issues when they don't function properly. The wastewater that exits the home will not receive adequate treatment. It can surface on the ground and flow into the local creeks. It can seep into the groundwater. So it's very important that these be maintained and function properly. Otherwise, you have a source of bacteria, pathogens, and nutrients that can cause contamination. The main factors that cause these systems to fail is a lack of maintenance. People don't properly pump the system when they need to, or maintain the pumps on their aerobic systems, flushing things that they shouldn't do. Things of that nature. System age is also an issue, especially with some of the aerobic systems. They all have mechanical parts. Those have a limited lifetime and have to be replaced. Inappropriate system design. Perhaps a system was put in, several, say 20 years ago, before aerobic systems were available. They put in a conventional system, but it may not be appropriate for the soil type, or they may be a system that was put in for a household where there was two people living there and the house is sold and now there's five people living there. Then you end up with hydraulic overload. You have too much water coming into the system cannot handle it, ends up overflowing. So you have sewage surfacing, and then you have the problem with the contamination of the groundwater and surface water. Also, alterations to the drain field. This recently happened at my parents' house, where my brother drove the tractor over the drain field and messed it up. You have situations such as, when Harvey flooded, those drain lines filled with water and silt. And then when everything dried out, the lines were silted in and no wastewater could flow through, backed up into the home or onto the surface. You also have grandfathered systems. These were systems that were installed before permits were required. It was in 1989 when permits were required. Um, so a lot of these older systems, um, a lot of them are working perfectly fine, but some of them aren't quite as efficient as the new systems. And then they are a little more prone to failure. Next slide. So with a malfunctioning system, like I mentioned, this can definitely cause some water quality issues. They can contribute significant nutrient and bacteria loads to the waterways, particularly those that are in close proximity, typically less than 500 feet away from a creek or a stream, because if the sewage is surfacing on the ground and you have a rain event, it can easily flow into that creek and contaminate not only that area but downstream as well. Um, so when we develop watershed-based plans, OSSFs are one of the things that we look at as a primary contributing source. And what we do is we try to estimate the number of systems in an area, but also the number of systems in an area that may be failing. Um, Typically, we can use a failure rate for the malfunctioning systems and factor that into our watershed-based plans. In most cases, this has to be an estimated figure. Um, if local data is not available, say from the authorized agent, who's the permitting authority, we can use literature values from published studies. Next slide. So what are the typical on-site sewage facility failure rates? According to the EPA, it's estimated nationwide that there's a 10 to 20% failure rate. Uh, Published data in Texas estimates the rate at 12%. So typically, if you don't have local, more specific data, 12% is what is used in developing these plans. But this can vary by location, socioeconomic factors, etc. The primary thing that helps, though, is local knowledge from either local stakeholders or the authorized agents, permitting authorities. This type of information is very helpful in developing the estimated failure rates. For example, in Westfield Estates, in their watershed protection plan, they used an estimation of 50% failure rate. But this is because they knew the age of the systems. They had a history of non-compliance with maintenance, and you had, the authorized agent there who had years worth of data related to enforcement cases and inspections due to system failures. So they had a really good estimation of what was going on there. So that really helps in developing these plans. Next slide. So how much bacteria comes from a failing on-site sewage facility? Just to do a little bit of math, estimate 1.0 times 10 to the seventh colony forming units of bacteria per 100 milliliters. It's 10 million bacteria, which is typical for untreated sewage, which is what would be flowing out if the system isn't working. Estimate a water usage of 70 gallons per person per day. This includes water used for bathing, flushing toilets, cooking, washing clothes, everything. So it seems kind of high, but it's really a pretty conservative value. estimate, say you're working with a watershed, you look at the census data. In this example, we're going to use an estimated 2.86 persons per household. This will vary for each watershed that you're looking at, but this is a typical value. And then a conversion factor from milliliters to gallons. Multiply that all out, and you end up with a potential daily load coming from an on-site sewage facility, a 7.58 times 10 to the 10th colony forming units of E. coli per household per day. This is 75,800,000,000 bacteria per household per day that could potentially be entering the watershed. So when you're looking at it on a watershed basis, you can take that number, multiply by the total number of households, and then by the estimated failure rate, and determine what the total bacteria load is estimated for that watershed. Next slide. The other thing that we factor in, we have a on-site sewage facility mapping tool. This is available online at the URL that's listed at the bottom of the slide. I believe we can post that in the chat as well. This is an online database and GIS mapping of all the permits within the 13 county region. This compiles data from all the permitting entities that submit data to us. We currently have a little over 111,000 permitted systems in the database, and we have estimated another 199,000 unpermitted OSSFs. This includes the grandfathered systems that we had mentioned earlier, for a total of 310,000 total systems estimated within the region. Next slide. So this online information system, it has a lot of functionality, and you're more than welcome to take a look at it. The first image on the left shows the basic screen, allows you to look at the concentration of on-site sewage facilities, the number per square mile. It's kind of like that weather map where it goes from green to red based upon concentration. So you can see where the areas where there's the most systems, and it's typically going to be Harris County and Montgomery County, southern portions of Montgomery County. You're also able to use this section to look at examine systems by age based upon the permit date. The second screenshot there shows how we're able to use the system to examine the location of individual systems based upon their GPS coordinates and their proximity to water bodies. In this particular screen, you're seeing two different colors. Those are two different permitting entities that are permitting systems next to this water body, but there's also some measuring tools in there that you can use to determine how physically close these are to the water body. So if you want to set up a range of say 500 feet, 1,000 feet, just to see how many are in that buffer, it allows you to do that. This third slide is how we estimate our unpermitted systems. So in this image, the areas that are in green are is a known permitted on-site sewage facility. The areas in yellow are homes that are within a service area boundary of a wastewater treatment facility. So they're on residential sewer. The ones in red are outside of a boundary of a service area boundary, but also do not have a permitted system. So those are how we can estimate that if there's a home on that parcel, there should be a system. If it's not permitted, we assume that it has an unpermitted system there, and that's how we make those estimations. Next slide. So there's several options to reducing pollution from on-site sewage facilities. These include increased repair and maintenance, making sure the pumps are working, repairing them if they're not, installing a new on-site sewage facility if you're able to do that. They're pretty expensive. Installation of low flow devices to reduce the influent volumes coming in so you don't get overload. Maintenance contracts, abandoning the system and connecting to residential sewer, and also our homeowner education programs to teach homeowners better ways to maintain their system. Next slide. So the homeowner
1 minute,
education.
Brian.
Okay, thank you. The homeowner education courses that we have, it's a 2-hour course that's offered throughout the region and usually in conjunction with one of our watershed protection plans. Topics include basic components and operations of the system, uh, guidance to assist homeowners with maintaining their systems, the do's and don'ts of operation. It does not authorize homeowners to maintain their system in lieu of a maintenance contract. Next slide. We also have a real estate visual inspection training course. This is a 6-hour course approved by the Texas Real Estate Commission for inspectors for septic systems. It goes in much greater depth on the operation, the types of systems, rules and regulations, records and documents, and also visual inspections of the system. Next slide. Unfortunately, due to COVID-19 and social distancing requirements, we haven't offered any courses this year. We are in the process of developing the homeowner education course for a virtual environment so we can do remote learning over Teams or over Zoom. The real estate inspector course, we may not be able to do that virtually because that course does have an in-person field component, which is the inspection of an actual functioning system. But we'll reevaluate that as the COVID-19 threat levels change. And that's the final slide. So if anybody has any questions, I will be more than happy to answer them.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brian. Appreciate that.
Great, thank you.
And then next we've got septic system repair and replacement by Daniel Albanese on our staff. Daniel?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Daniel Albanese here with H-GAC. This is just to go over one of our programs that we offer through H-GAC for septic system repair and replacement. Next slide, please. So this project provides assistance to low-income homeowners to repair or replace malfunctioning or failing on-site septic systems. Next slide, please. In order to be qualified for this program, you have to own and reside in the home. The home has to be within one of the 15 eligible counties. You have to have a combined household income at or below 80% of the median income for the county. And you have to have a failed or malfunctioning OSSF system. Next slide, please. Sources of funding are from TCEQ and the Harris County District Attorney's Office. Next slide, please. A little bit of history. To date, we have utilized a little over $330,000 in funding. We have 39 applicants that have qualified and are on the ever-growing waiting list. There are 14 OSSF repairs to date, 24 replacement aerobic systems installed. We have 2 replacements upcoming, both in Brazoria County. We also have provided 7 pump outs for homeowners in Bailey's Prairie and Brazoria County. Next slide, please. Here are a few pictures of some of the failing systems that we come across out there in the field. And then here are 2 recent ones that we did October of 2020 and January of 2021. Next slide, please. Next steps would be we are going to continue marketing the SEP program to potential contributors. We will continue to seek qualified applicants by going to our local authorized agents and designated representatives, referrals from any local government officials and agencies, public outreach events, and word of mouth from previous program recipients. We also will continue identifying qualified vendors or contractors to do the installations. Next slide, please. This is just a quote from one of our recipients up there in Baytown. And next slide, please. For more information, you can contact me either through email or on my cell phone or phone. Any questions? Please refer them to me. Thank you.
Okay, any questions for Daniel? It's a very exciting program. It's really makes a difference in the lives of the people that whose systems we're repairing or replacing, but it also really improves quality of life for the folks in those communities. So we're really proud of the work that's being done there. And like Daniel said, these are funded through supplemental environmental projects. So it's fines for folks that have had a problem with wastewater. They've made an agreement with TCEQ to pay into one of these SEPs. So if you're aware of any fines that are out there, always looking to encourage those folks to contribute to the SEPs that are out there. So if there are no questions, we'll move on to Kendall Goodrow. She's going to talk about non-point source education, our coastal communities toolbox, some of our interactive exhibits, and more. So Kendall.
All right, thank you, Todd. Like you said, I'm Kendall Goodrow with H-GAC, and I'm going to talk about all of the different non-point source pollution outreach and education items that H-GAC has either developed or has available for all of you to use among your residents with your outreach efforts. To start with, one of the most easily accessible resources is the Coastal Communities Toolbox, which is available online. That's what I'm going to spend most of my time today talking about. But after that, I'll also share some of the physical resources H-GAC has developed that can be loaned out for use at schools, fairs, or other events, and a few other projects that have some outreach aspects to them as well. But getting started, can you go back, Andrea? Thanks. Getting started, H-GAC has worked with staff from local municipalities, outreach organizations, and other interested stakeholders over several years to develop an outreach plan and toolbox that supports coastal communities in providing water quality outreach with the overall goal to reduce bacteria concentrations in area waterways. This Coastal Communities project is specifically geared towards small, non-MS4 communities in the coastal counties, but all resources are free and they're available to any community who's interested in using them. Despite outreach and education being identified as necessary measures in many of the water quality plans Todd mentioned at the beginning of this meeting, it's sometimes difficult to implement them to the desired extent. This can be especially true in smaller communities where staff wear many hats and where time and money can be very scarce resources. So the Coastal Communities Project is intended to bridge the gap between these needs that are identified by communities and the education and outreach measures that are identified by those water quality plans. After meeting with stakeholders, H-GAC decided to have the Coastal Communities Project focus on 4 behaviors that impact water quality levels or impact bacteria levels in waterways and were a concern for the cities that we spoke with. Those 4 program areas are the disposals of pet waste, the disposal of fats, oils, and grease or FOG, litter and illegal dumping, and the maintenance of on-site sewage facilities. Each of those focused behaviors requires only one action, one small change in resident routines to make a difference, which makes them excellent targets for outreach and education efforts. To help remove barriers to community outreach, such as the staff time, money, and experience with these topics, H-GAC created the Coastal Communities Outreach Toolbox and Roadmap to serve as a one-stop shop for city staff to find resources to either build or enhance their outreach campaigns. Rather than reinventing the wheel, we hope communities can use these resources to spend less time building an outreach campaign and more time actually engaging with their residents. Next slide. So to give you an idea of what we have developed through the project, I want to introduce you briefly to that outreach toolbox and roadmap. So the Coastal Communities website, which is found at coastalcommunitiestx.com, houses all of the resources in our toolbox. And if you haven't already, I'd encourage you to check it out and see what can be of use to you. Included in the toolbox are the outreach roadmap and roadmap messages, which can help a city develop and implement an outreach campaign related to one of the project focus areas I mentioned earlier. It also includes information on H-GAC and partner programs or resources that address one of our topic areas or could help add to your outreach and education efforts. We also have things like example ordinances from cities that are related to those topic areas, links to funding, training, or meeting opportunities that we know of that might be helpful to your communities. And as you're going through, please know that we're also always happy to work with communities who are interested in these resources to go over how they can best meet your needs. Next slide. One of those key resources that I mentioned is the toolbox was those roadmap messages, which are a full year's worth of created messages related to those 4 focus topics that are free to download and available in 4 formats for either use either digitally or in print. We also have a roadmap calendar, which lists suggested messages for each month, showing when a message might be particularly relevant. However, in all but a few cases, these messages can be used year-round to make sure that they fit whenever your community thinks that they're most needed. Examples of some of the messages for the 4 topic areas are shown here, but there are multiple designs for each topic, as well as messages for related topics, such as wipes in the pipes. Next slide. As I said, each set of messages is available in 4 downloadable formats. Those are a social media graphic, a web banner, an 8.5 by 11-inch flyer, and a bill insert, which is about the size of 1/3 of a page. Some of them, like this pet waste message, have the bill insert already downloadable with 3 copies to a page, but most are downloaded as just the graphic set to a specific size, such as on the next slide. Such as here in this wipes in the pipes example message, where you would just download the graphic and it'd be set to that 1/3 of a size, 1/3 of a page size. Next slide. So items are customizable. When you download the graphics, you are welcome to add things like your own logo or any hashtags or messaging your city likes to use, such as Bay City did in this example for their social media graphic. H-GAC can also help edit individual graphics for project communities if they don't have the ability to do it themselves. Next slide. In addition to the resources that have already been developed, H-GAC hopes to expand the Coastal Communities Toolbox based on stakeholder feedback from several trainings and meetings. While the roadmap messages have been developed, interest was expressed in adding resources such as infographics or suggested language to go with each of the topics so that staff who were less familiar with the topics could draw on it to enhance social media posts, community letters, or other engagement tools. We hope to keep expanding the toolbox to best serve communities' needs. So any feedback on messaging or resources is always welcome. Next slide. So beyond the Coastal Communities website, H-GAC also maintains an inventory of interactive displays, exhibits, posters, brochures, and best management practice items focused on reducing water pollution. The displays and exhibits can be loaned out to communities to use at local resident-facing events, such as farmers markets and other kinds of fairs that you might hold. Brochures and best management practice items like pet waste bag dispensers are available upon request in project areas as long as supplies last to supplement displays and exhibits with a useful takeaway message. There are 4 interactive exhibits or games, each with an interactive display, a poster, and a pledge that participants can take. Most of the posters for the interactive exhibits are also available in Spanish and Vietnamese, and digital versions of these posters are available for download in all 3 languages on the Coastal Communities website. Next slide. So this is one of the first exhibits we have. It's called Pitch the Poop. It's an interactive exhibit teaching about how pet waste can add to bacteria levels in our waterways when not properly disposed of. Participants take pet waste, out of Play-Doh, in a pet waste bag and pitch it into the trash can. In addition to the poster and pledge, this exhibit also comes with a small trash can and an A-frame sandwich board to attach to the poster as a backdrop for the tossing game. So pet waste bag dispensers and refill bags are some of the best management practice giveaway items that are available in our project areas, as we said. Next slide. Another game we call Don't Feed the Grease Monster utilizes images and messaging from the Cease the Grease campaign, which is headed in our region by the Galveston Bay Foundation, so that residents might better associate the language with proper fog disposal. In the game, participants drop blue marbles, which represent water, down 3 tubes in the display. 1 tube is open, 1 is partially blocked with spray foam, and the 3rd has a complete blockage. After the marbles have been dropped into all 3 tubes, the front display art can be removed to show the blockages and discuss what happens when fats, oils, and grease go down the drain. We also have funnels and scrapers available for those coastal communities who are interested in borrowing this exhibit. Next slide. Another game we have discusses runoff and how low impact development can help reduce the non-point sources of pollution that end up in our waterways. The display is broken up into 3 yards. 1 has a flat rubber material to place on it. The second has the scraping part of the sponge. So if it's one of those yellow and green sponges, it's that green part. And then the 3rd has a complete sponge. Water is then poured along the top of the display, show how different materials either allow or absorb runoff water. Next slide. Our 4th and most recent interactive game deals with litter in our waterways and the different options for disposal. So participants use magnetic fishing poles to fish different types of common litter items from the waterway. After they fish the item from the watershed, the poster actually continues the interaction by asking participants to choose where that item should have gone in the first place to avoid becoming litter. Options include, putting it in the trash can, recycling it at home or at a recycling facility, stores, or special household hazardous waste facilities, reducing use of the item, or simply reusing it. There are magnetic strips on the poster so that items can stay on the poster until everything has been fished from the watershed to help start discussions of proper recycling and the other options. Small Earth 911 magnets are available upon request for a giveaway item. If you're not aware, Earth 911 is an online platform where you can look up locations to recycle specific items in your area, as well as providing just helpful information on recycling in general. Other activities, including Enviroscapes and the materials and lesson plan for Freddy the Fish, an activity that we have a lesson plan for, are also available. Instructions and talking points for each game and activity are available in an instructional guide as well. So if you borrow any of the items through the loan out program, you should have everything you need to staff the exhibit at an event. To borrow any of these materials with the loan out program, all you have to do is email the Water Resources email on the website. And if the material is available, we'll schedule a time for you to come pick it up from H-GAC. We have several sets of each display. So if someone else has it checked out, we usually have another still available. But one thing to note, if you're interested in borrowing one of these items, is that many of these displays, including the 4 interactive games, are used during the River Lakes Bays and Bayous Trash Bash event at the end of March each year. So to make sure that everything is in good condition and available for Trash Bash, we don't usually loan out the games in March, and we usually ask that if they have been loaned out, they're returned by that 2nd week in March. But other than that, they are available for the other 7, 8, 11 months out of the year. So next slide. In addition to the coastal communities and the physical resources we have, HGAC is also working on a new project that pairs well with the coastal communities resources. HGAC is partnering with the North Central Texas Council of Governments and the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment on a trash-free waters project called Trash Free Texas, basin-wide community engagement strategies to reduce aquatic debris, which is a mouthful, so we usually just call it Trash Free Texas. This project covers a significant geography from the Dallas-Fort Worth area all the way to our own region. And there are several aspects of this project which can assist with your litter cleanup outreach and implementation efforts. We'd be happy to discuss how we can work with your community to either add adopt-a-spot sites to the Trash Free Texas website to help connect volunteers to locations that frequently need to be cleaned, or to use some of the resources we're currently developing that will help with your litter outreach and education campaigns or events, such as a community cleanup challenge toolkit, which should be available by the end of this year. This project is just getting started in our region, so please visit the websites listed here on the slides to learn more, and we would love to discuss how your communities can get involved. Next slide. And finally, HGAC also coordinates a regional group of Texas Stream Team citizen scientists who conduct volunteer water quality monitoring as part of a statewide program. The program involves 3 phases of training: monthly monitoring of a specific site on a local waterway, and quality assurance of data through protocols and review. Data is posted to the HGAC's Water Resources Information Map, or our RIM, and sent to the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment to be included with the rest of the program data from the state. Due to COVID, trainings are currently on hold and a few monitoring stations have gone inactive, but we do hope to be able to restart trainings soon. Next slide. So thank you all for joining us today. And if you have any questions about the Coastal Communities Project or any of the other resources or projects that I've discussed today, please feel free to email me or give me a call at the contact information listed on this slide. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions for Kendall?
Thought there was a question in the chat that was asking, is the messaging available in different languages? I know you spoke about the posters, but the messaging for the communities in the Coastal Communities Toolbox?
Right, so the posters, which are on the digital versions of those game posters, are available in Spanish and Vietnamese on the Coastal Communities website. The other messaging is not yet available in different languages, but if that's something that your communities would find useful, please feel free to send me an email. We'd love to get that feedback. Thank you.
Great. Any other questions for Kendall? Okay, so we obviously some thunderstorms popping up in the area today, kind of widespread in different places. And since we're all hither and yon, our slide, the person running the slide, Stephen Johnston, has just lost power at his location. And so we've got a backup, and I think Kathy Jansen is going to be able to take over our slide presentation. So we may have just a few minutes to get that back up and running. This is a great thing about technology and kind of widespread thunderstorm activity, right?
Going to be just a moment. Bear with me.
We do have a question in the chat. Is will the links shown for all the presentations be available online after the meeting? And it's my understanding that we do intend to post all of the presentations on our CWI website after this meeting. And if that wasn't the intent, it probably is now, since I've said it out loud in this meeting. So yes, the links will be shown for all the presentations, and I will post that link for you in the chat right now. Todd, I think we may have lost Kathy too.
Oh boy, okay.
I think I'm up next. I can run my presentation. I've got it up in front of me.
Go for it. Oh, no, is that your screen? Yeah.
Yeah, there it is.
Okay.
No, that's not me. Kathy must be.
Oh, okay.
Good to go.
Okay, Justin, take it away.
Well, hello, everyone. Justin Bauer, Principal Planner with the Water Resources Group here at H-GAC. And I'm going to be talking something a little farther afield from our typical water quality focus. Can I get the next slide, please? There we go. So like many things with our group, our work has been iterative. We started out with the great work of the Clean Rivers program that Todd and others talked about a while ago. And when we had all these vast stores of data and we knew there were issues and we had all these wonderful stakeholders, we said, well, what do we do with this data? How do we move this water quality issue forward? And that's when we started to get involved with the total maximum daily load and the watershed protection plans and other sort of implementation and planning projects, taking that data, that knowing there's an issue, and then moving to what do we do about it? As we've worked through a lot of these, we've started to ask that iterative question again. Okay, we've got this planning thing, working on water quality. What is the other stuff that's related to water quality that affects water quality or is affected by water quality? Sort of those adjacent spheres. What's going on there? How does that relate to what we're doing, and how do we build some bridges? What's going on with flood mitigation that we should know about because it's going to affect our water quality? What's going on, as we see here, with urban forestry? So I want to talk a little bit about our newer efforts with urban forestry and riparian buffers and riparian cover. And this came about kind of like I was talking with, as we've worked through these watershed projects, it's been my great pleasure to work with just such a broad number of stakeholders and community members, often who aren't specific to water quality, who overlap a lot of fields because there's a lot of stuff that goes on in a watershed. And one of the really great partnerships we formed is with folks like Mac Martin and others at Texas A&M Forest Service and many of the other urban forestry oriented organizations that are active in the Houston area. And urban forest may sound somewhat like a misnomer. So you can see this map on the screen. This is essentially kind of the core of the region, sort of Houston proper. I'm just using this as an example. It's certainly something we would note in any of the urban areas. The red colors here are for development. So red and pink, this is what shows up in our land cover data as developed. Can you advance the slide one for me, please? But there's another story going on. So here in this map, you see all this green. This is the urban forest of Houston. So even though when you look at land cover, you don't see this as a forest. It doesn't show up as the nice greens that, you know, a forest up in the piney woods would show up as. There is a dense and thriving urban forest in Houston. And obviously it's not as equitably distributed as maybe a lot of us would like, but there is, you know, anyone who's driven west on 10 and looked north or south, you don't see mostly buildings, you see a dense canopy of trees. Part of that's because we have a lot of lower lying development, but there is a thriving urban forest in Houston, and the impacts of that forest are appreciable. You know, we may traditionally have thought of trees and forests as, you know, that's nature, that's where we go to. That's when we go up to Huntsville, you know, that's when we go down to Brazos Bend, you know, that's the nature that we go to. But that nature, and more importantly, that natural function is really where we're at. And that's important to understand when we're talking about all these issues that lie at the fringes of water quality, flood mitigation and urban forestry and biodiversity and heat reduction. Can I have the next slide, please? So like I said, that urban forest, not just in Houston, but the entire region, it provides tangible services. It's not just, you know, and as much as I'm an avid hiker and birder and outdoorsy sort of person. And so trees have, you know, not to get too deep into the philosophy, but trees have an intrinsic value to me. There are real tangible values beyond that aesthetic. You know, tree canopy is an incredible heat reduction. It has an incredible heat reduction effect, a huge amount of stormwater interception and filtration, changing the way the hydrograph works, you know, slowing down the amount of water that's getting into our streams and causing flooding issues. Tremendous health benefits, both from reducing pollution and heat, as well as a host of other things. Really definable, tangible water and air quality benefits. So our water is cleaner because of our urban forest. Our air quality is incredibly cleaner based on our urban forest. When we look at the impacts for a given area, if we're working in a watershed, we can actually model, look, so many pounds of air quality pollutant per tree per day. And when you start adding it up, it's incredible. And that, for an area like Houston and the broader Houston region, being able to use natural systems as part of the way we work toward air quality improvement is incredible, because they're serving so many other purposes at the same time. And that's even before you start talking about some things that may be less tangible or less wallet-oriented values like biodiversity and habitat, you know. But even then, you know, this area, not an unappreciable amount of economic revenue comes from ecotourism. Birders and other folks, you know, we may not have the majestic mountains of some areas, but there are a lot of people who come here and spending money here because of some of the things that our urban forests and others are able to support. And then you can talk about things that are more future focused, like carbon reduction. So without belaboring this, you know, I could talk for 15 minutes about why I love trees and why they're fantastic for the region. There are real tangible benefits of our urban forest. And we as a region are really starting to build those considerations into what we do. It really is the focus of a lot of local efforts. And when I'm talking in a second about HGAC's role, I want to put that in the context that, you know, we are not stepping into this realm saying, hey, trees are great, we are now the expert on trees. As much as I love trees and as much as I have, you know, a conservation and a biology background, I'm not a forester. So one of the things we are trying to do is accent and support the tremendous amount of work that's already going on. And we're going to talk about some of those examples in a second. And I could spend this whole presentation talking about the tremendous amount of focus that's being put on urban forestry, but it's really happening at all levels. City of Houston, for example, has taken some huge initiative steps that build trees in as natural infrastructure as part of resilience and climate adaptation, down to, you know, we're working on some projects that are really looking to do some great sort of spot reforestation and build in some corporate partners. And we'll go into that a bit. But there's just a tremendous amount of activity that has been going on. We have a wonderful non-governmental organization community, nonprofit community, as well as some great activity by our local governments. So we have the basis and the capacity as a region to really use this system of natural function to address some of the really big issues that we're facing. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing, but this is less to say, hey, look at all the great work HGAC is doing, and more to get out to you, here's where we're involved. More importantly, here's where we can support you. Here's where we're interested in finding more partnerships, finding ways to support our local governments or organizations, even in our residents. Some of my most productive conversations, and I actually see a couple of my favorite stakeholders are online today, have been just talking with local landowners, and they come to me and say, I'd like to do this. We have a sort of a riparian area along our stream bank, used to have trees, doesn't now. Where's the resources? How do I do this? I don't know where to start. And us being able to use our resources to put them in touch with people. Our first and foremost role, and kind of where we stepped into this, like I said, coming out of that, understanding that there's a huge impact on water quality from urban forest, was to look at what's going on in the region and how it's coordinated. And I think after we talked to a lot of our partners that were engaged in urban forestry, we had some fantastic work being done, but there was some coordination that could potentially benefit those efforts. We weren't looking at things as a region, the same way that we do for things like water supply or flood management with the new regional flood planning groups. There are these big, high-level planning efforts that support all the fantastic work that's being done. So we ran our Houston area urban forest project, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, where we looked at what was being done, where there were opportunities to enhance that, sort of what the impediments were, what the challenges were, and more importantly, what the concerns were for our member governments and our organizations who were actively involved in urban forest management. Everything from, we're really concerned about emerald ash borer and what that could potentially do to the area, to, hey, we need better resources for native nursery stock. We just don't have the capacity. Or, hey, wouldn't it be great if we had some ongoing, seminars or workshops where we could exchange information? There's a lot of that happens at a fantastically informal level, and it's been great to get involved with that. But we wanted to take it up to that regional level, like we do with other things, even in HGAC with watershed protection and in transportation, and look for ways to support the things that we have in common as a region. And that's that second piece. How do we as HGAC provide regional support? So some of it's been our ongoing efforts with other local groups to work to, even if it's just to serve on a committee. I'm a board member or serve on steering committee for, I can't even tell you how many tree organizations now. I never would have thought of that 5 years ago. But to be able to be at the table and say, when someone's talking about, I wish we had the spatial data that would help our planting, say, hey, we have that, we can help you. Let us put you in touch with our data resources, or let us help you do some of that. One of the biggest issues, understandably, that a lot of our partners brought up was funding. We obviously all work within budget constraints, and even before the COVID era, post Harvey, this is not an easy budget environment. And making the case and finding the resources to do things like urban forestry, which aren't the direct things that people look at for city services, fire, police, keeping the water running, it's sometimes a challenge. And a lot of that can come through, finding additional sources. So we've worked with several of our local governments to find grants, or to help pursue grants, or even be the lead on a grant. And something that's more in our wheelhouse. Again, we're not the experts. We're not getting out there defining what a city should be doing for urban forestry, or talking about what the best practices are. We are trying to bring additional resources to coordinate between our organizations and potentially find ways to move forward as a region on some of this. One of the things that, again, is in our wheelhouse, and we do as a stockpile and a clearinghouse for spatial data, for GIS data, as well as a lot of other data, is to help do some data analyses for some of our partners. So if we have partners who may not have the capacity or may not have the staff time to be able to put toward the sort of data analyses they need to identify a priority for their next planting, or to support a grant proposal, we can help with that. And that's something that we can do without being the forestry experts. So it all comes back to that concept of one team, many players. We're not here to be the pinch hitter, but maybe we're the management, supporting along the way. To give you an example of some of the ways we have been involved, and I've touched on a couple of these, and mostly as sort of a leader into what I hope are some conversations with y'all about how we can engage with you on similar projects. I mentioned that Houston area urban forest project, and I'm not going to belabor that too much, but that was our real first foray into bringing all those urban forestry groups together, to coordinating sort of discussions, just getting folks around the same table so we can start hashing through what are the shared priorities for the region? How do we move that forward? How do we start talking about some of these shared priorities with a more unified voice that will, look better on grant proposals, that will get more attention from regulators, that will give us some weight in large scale funding? If we're talking about all the wonderful flood mitigation funding sources, how do we as a region put forth that, look, natural infrastructure is a big piece of flood mitigation in our area, and it needs to be represented, and we want it to be on that, on the dashboard. The city of Houston, it's been my incredible pleasure to work with Kelly Andrashik and some of the other wonderful folks at Houston Parks who are doing just really innovative work. It's been great to talk at national conferences and things with folks about what's going on in urban forestry in our region, and being able to point at some of the great work that Houston and some of our other cities have done. And one of the things that, like all our organizations, there are limitations on staff capacity and funding capacity. So we've been able to work with them and potentially lend them some expertise on doing the legwork on some grant proposals, helping put some grant proposals together, potentially being an applicant on some grant proposals. We haven't had anything come through yet, but I'm very hopeful that as we continue down that path, we can hopefully be that supporter and move some resources into the area. Because it benefits more than just the city. It benefits everyone who's attached to those water resources and all the other benefits those trees are providing. One of the pieces that I am incredibly excited, if it's not clear, this whole concept, this whole sphere excites me a lot, and I tend to be the cheerleader, internally for trees in the region. We've had the chance to work with Texas A&M Forest Service, my good colleague over there, Mac Martin, who had been involved in a pilot project looking at using corporate funding and corporate sponsorship to do some reforestation where maybe there weren't resources on a governmental side, and especially sort of smaller scale, public involved sort of plantings. And as opposed to a traditional model, maybe where there's some sponsorship and then there's great work being done, the intent was to give something back, to provide them with a tangible good. And so what they set up was the ability to do some modeling to show for the donation that was made, look, here's literally what the model shows in terms of this many gallons of stormwater averted or this much carbon reduced, so that entity can then use that for their internal reports, their regulatory filings, if they have something along those lines, something to show and some tangible value to hopefully really generate a lot of interest. So Matt came and talked to me and some other folks in the Houston area and said, hey, I think this is a really great program. What if we did this as a pilot in the Houston area? And I said, that's a fantastic idea. One of the big challenges we have is mobilizing not only some funding, but mobilizing some support and some interest in areas and users outside of our sort of the choir. To talking to our corporate partners and having a way for them to be tangibly and directly involved that also supports them. So we picked Cypress Creek. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff going on in Cypress Creek with flood mitigation challenges and water quality issues and development, all those issues that we face as a region in a microcosm. And water quality, we just got done doing a watershed protection plan for Cypress Creek. So we thought that was a great place to start as a model for the region, and we're off and running. We were able to get some funding through some corporate partners. Trees for Houston has stepped up as a really big partner in terms of doing some of the logistics with the trees. We've got multiple people involved in this process. All the big names in terms of who's doing work are involved in this at some level or another, and we've got plantings scheduled. So it's been a great way to move from this upper scale planning, which is typically our bailiwick, into some real on the ground implementation, because we thought it was really important as a region to have both sides. We have some very large scale planting efforts that go on, but we wanted to be able to balance that with something that was repeatable at a neighborhood scale, at a municipal utility district scale, something that could fill in those gaps and really engage our corporate partners. So that's been a tremendous success so far, and we'd love to duplicate that in other areas. Have the next slide, please.
I apologize. I'm having some technical difficulties with advancing the slides. I apologize. Let's see if this works better. Oh, there we go.
Great. Well, before I start talking real quick about riparian function and that side issue, we have put together a tremendous amount of resources on our webpage and through our partner organizations' web pages for people engaged in urban forestry. We have an online GIS tool. It's available at the link in the chat. All of our tools and that sort of stuff is available online. And we would love to talk to you. I'll make the big plug. We would love to talk to you about what's going on with your organization, your land, your property, your government, ways we can support you. We really do think urban forestry is beginning to be a huge part of the planning for the region. The City of Houston with Resilient Houston and the Climate Action Plan have put really progressive and high-level goals like 4.6 million new native trees into their planning, where we're really seeing this taking off as a region, and we want to be here to support you all in that. So please don't hesitate to get in contact with us. We would love to talk trees, or I would love to talk trees any day of the week. The other aspect, given that a lot of our region may not have, a lot of our region isn't forest to begin with. A lot of, even the Houston area was canebrake swamp and coastal prairie. So unlike some other areas, we really have seen our forest grow with our city, which is really cool as an urban experiment. But there is a lot of area that's coastal wetlands and prairie and grasslands, where even if we can't look at that riparian area, that area alongside the stream, and say, man, there's a lot of trees that need to go here. We can still look at the way vegetation and vegetative buffers and riparian function really helps protect water quality. So streamside areas, we say riparian, we're really talking about that area directly adjacent to the stream, are really the last line of defense for water quality. There are some things that, get piped directly in from industry and from municipal outputs and stormwater, but a lot of the water that's flowing across the land and bringing all those pollutants that we've talked about are coming directly into our streams. And when there's a barrier alongside the stream, you're able to slow those flows, promote more infiltration, filter out some of those contaminants. And when you don't have that buffer, you get higher velocity, you get more water coming in more quickly, and you're exacerbating not just the water quality, but obviously the flooding issues and everything that goes along with that. One of the things I like about talking about riparian buffers and riparian function, and one of the reasons we started to look at how we could support, again, and I'm going to talk about our tool in a second, is that it really goes the full transect of the region. There are opportunities to look at how we restore and maintain and manage our riparian areas in urban areas. Think of things like Terry Hershey Park in the greater Houston area. Looking at the areas around our riparian areas as function, as not just aesthetic, as not just parkland, but really part of the function of that system. But also in our suburban areas as we continue to develop outwards, and in our rural areas, looking at, with our legacy agriculture, some of our best stewards of our land are our agricultural producers. It is a good day for me when I get a chance to talk to one of our producers. They know the land better than anyone. They understand, what's good for the land and what's good for the water is good for their production. A lot of times, some of the challenges, other than sort of the perception, is how do we get some resources? How do we put some resources in folks' hands so that they can do these things that may benefit their production or their habitat, but also have a benefit for water quality in the streams. So there's a lot of existing programs.
1 minute, Justin.
Excellent. A lot of existing programs through our agricultural entities. I'd be happy to talk with anyone about what resources are out there. We have a riparian buffer tool to help people make some of these decisions about how restoring a riparian buffer on their property, what impact that would have for their land's productivity, what benefits it potentially has. Again, love to talk to you all about that. And the urban forestry and riparian function are increasingly a part of what we're looking at with our water quality issues and our water quality efforts like watershed protection plans. Next slide. So again, my name's Justin Bauer. This is my contact information. I'd be happy to talk to anybody anytime about all this. I'm always excited about setting up new partnerships and seeing how we can support you. But with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Anyone have any questions for Justin?
We have one quick comment in the chat, may not be a question. It's we find people can grasp the idea of that forests and riparian areas are catchment areas as opposed to watershed areas. This is from Terry MacArthur up in the Spring Creek area, and she says they've been trying to incorporate that language and would love to see help putting that out there.
Great, Terry. I would love to talk to you about that. I think between us and Forest Service and some of our other partners, we've got some great model materials and language, because you're absolutely right. And I think one of the things that's been really important for us to gain some traction and get people to understand the values is, folks have their tangible values. And for a lot of the Houston area, that, a big piece of that is flood mitigation. Well, trees have some overlap there. And that overlap, I think, is really part of the selling point. Really, getting people beyond this concept of, oh, trees are pretty and nice. That's great. That's pretty. No, this is flood. This is infrastructure. This is natural infrastructure, but it doesn't make it any less infrastructure.
Great. Thank you so much, Justin. Well, it looks like Stephen is back online and got the power back. So I'm going to turn it over to him to talk about green infrastructure.
Great. I survived the thunderstorm and it's passed me by and I'm ready to go. Our focus today, again, green infrastructure. I might talk about, or I might bring in the term LID, or low impact development. Sort of an older term, but we still see it in a lot of our documents, including some of the ones I'll show you today. So just in case I say green infrastructure or I say low impact development or LID, kind of think of those as synonymous. Although the terms are some archaic things or reasons you might not use them in exchange with one another. Just want you to be aware of that as that comes up in the discussion today. The right screen here. Just to let you know why HGAC is involved with green infrastructure programs. It aligns with several of our planning efforts, not just the three that you see on the screen, but many of our planning efforts here at HGAC. Green infrastructure plays a part and role, much as Justin was talking about riparian zones and areas and tree cover. A lot of those are considered green infrastructure if you use them. And so it's really part and parcel for what we're trying to do here. Again, HGAC is a planning organization. So things like our Great Region 2040 plan for regional sustainability includes programs and factors that would lend itself to green infrastructure. Regional Flood Management Council, again, looking at flooding and looking at all the potential ways in which you can manage for floods. Green infrastructure is a part of that. It's not the answer. It's not a panacea. It's going to get you free from flooding, but it's part of that managing stormwater. And then watershed-based planning, what we're really talking about at this workshop today, plans like the bacteria implementation groups, implementation blend, all include usually managing stormwater. And one of those kinds of strategies is to use green infrastructure to do that. And Justin was alluding to HGAC's main role in this region is really to be a convener, to bring parties together, local governments and other stakeholders to tackle major issues and the like. And so green infrastructure is part of that dynamic and discussion. Just wanted to bring in a sense of that survey that we provide you so that you see that, hey, we put that survey to good work. In terms of green infrastructure, those that are attending today, most of you are familiar with the term, whether it's green infrastructure or LID. There's a few out there that this may be new, and so we'll be covering a little bit of that. And this really is a high-level presentation. We're going to go into too great detail just because I don't have the time to talk about it in that detail. Additionally, there was a question about the types of feasibility of various topical areas. Stormwater wetlands and vegetative strips are a clear winner here, as well as bioswales. And that makes sense in terms of their use and the ability to put them into work. Whereas green roofs are more expensive, and you have to put those in a limited supply, limited areas. And so it makes sense for that result there. Looking at the real big thing that's going to be happening in our region, if you've lived here long enough, you're aware of it. It's going to be population growth. The 2020 census just came out, and certainly all of our counties grew, but especially the urban counties, Harris County and the counties surrounding grew this past decade. And it's going to continue to grow into 2040 and 2050. We're looking to still add probably 3.5 million more people to this region. And one of those things, byproducts, is going to be the infrastructure, concrete, housing, any of those hard structures that don't absorb water, and typically the water just runs off. And so one of the things that we can do is to look at new ways to build, new ways to offset for that infrastructure and that infrastructure need. And infrastructure is one of those practices that can help us with that. Again, it's not the end and be all, but it can certainly be a part of the discussion. Looking at how those infrastructure and what types of things come along with population growth. That 3 million or so folks will be needing parking spaces that, when not in use, are just concrete that's the water runs off of. And so managing for the 6 million parking spaces is important. Since we're in COVID, maybe we won't need 680 million square feet of business and office space. Maybe down the line we won't be needing that requirement, but just looking at what current standards are, you potentially would need about 680 million square feet just to address that. And then housing's the largest, just in nature, 3.5 billion square feet, just to address the numbers of folks that will be here and needing places to live. Looking at a little bit more detail in terms of housing, about 1.4 billion single family units, or 390 Cinco ranches. Just for reference, Cinco Ranch has about 4,000 housing units within its confines. So a large number of houses and a large number of area taken up by those homes. Looking at those parking spaces, got 6 million parking spaces equates to about 230 NRG parking lots. And again, lots that if it's just concrete, the water runs off and without any potential benefit to water quality. And so thinking about these things as we go through this presentation, keep in mind that growth and infrastructure that's needed for it. Looking at what green infrastructure does. And so it's a comprehensive stormwater management method. Again, it ties in directly with flood management, as well as addressing, trying to address stormwater and where that stormwater goes with regards to how it works. It essentially tries to diffuse the rainfall runoff, make it go through various different practices that kind of slows it down. It gives it an opportunity on site, on the property, to have a chance to go through filtering, whether it's through lawn or it's through vegetative cover, or it's through some kind of filter method, trying to slow it down before it reaches those hard surfaces and before it reaches the storm drains and storm sewer. So that's generally what green infrastructure is trying to do, trying to mimic some natural hydrology, getting back to what was maybe there before the building was put there. And so that's generally what it does. And where can it be placed? It can generally be placed in new developments. It can be placed into redevelopments when those happen. Parking lots can make use of different types of practices, as well as roadways and park spaces. Let's look at several different types of practices. This is kind of what it looks like. Here's a bioswale on Bagby Street in town, Houston. You've seen these if you go to various marketplaces, various like Whole Earth or World Market, rain barrels, harvesting, rain gardens. Typically, a rain garden has some kind of engineered soil to kind of help infiltration. Again, we have a lot of clay soils, but it doesn't mean you can't use permeable pavers, or you can't use some of these practices. You might just have to engineer it slightly different. Again, permeable pavement works really great in areas where you have a lot of hill infiltration, but you might have to use other techniques to allow it to be used. Wetland detention. So instead of just a basic dry bottom detention, you include a base amount of water and you grow a wetland. And then when you get influxes of water, the opportunity for the wetland to help to remove sediments, to remove litter, to remove various nutrients, as well as bacteria. Again, that's an opportunity for filtration. Green roofs, I mentioned that briefly. Again, not for everywhere, but certainly it's an option if you have the money and you can afford to put one on your roof. It's certainly an option as this tool chest of options here. Planter boxes intercept water before it goes into the inlet. Again, an opportunity to have engineered soils and roots that take up some of those potential pollutants in the water. Underground storage can be for any types of these projects, including pavers. An opportunity, again, if you have clay soils and trying to maximize underground storage of water. Again, you can reuse the water. In some cases, you can filter it for drinking, but oftentimes just for irrigation. Maybe just like the rain barrel, you'll drain it after a storm to be ready for the next storm. And so those are various tools in our tool chest to be able to open up and use and to put in for manage our stormwater. Looking at it from a more holistic scale, so maybe your property, you put in a green roof It drains when it drains off. Sometimes it doesn't. But when it does, it goes into some kind of cistern or rain barrel, of which you can store the water and use it for irrigation, or you might drain it down to prepare yourself for the next rainstorm. It might, if the rainstorm was big enough, overflow into the rain garden. Again, you have engineered soils here in this naturally vegetated area that allows for it to filter through those engineered soils at a certain rate. If it's too much for that, there will be a standpipe to allow the water to overflow into that and going into your rain bioswales or your planter boxes. After then, it goes into your wetland detention and then finally into your waterway. This is usually referred to as a treatment train. And again, it works very much like the original prairies that used to be here in the Houston area, where you'd have depression after depression and the water would kind of move through those depressions. So again, trying to mimic a natural area. Some of the benefits, I've already kind of talked about water quality benefits as well as potential flood impacts, reducing those impacts. So let's focus on things like cost effective. Typically, if you look at lid or green infrastructure, potentially can lower your building costs. You may not need as much concrete. You may not need as much piping. So a lot of those infrastructure needs that are used in some of the conventional practices, you may not need as much. Additionally, there's opportunities to recoup some of your costs. The Texas Commission on Environmental Quality has a program where you can roll some of that into the mud bonding structure, and so you can recoup some of those costs as well. And some of the cities and counties have benefits, incentives to help you pay for the cost of these or to offset. The City of Houston has recently started an incentive program for these practices. You might look into that, especially if you're a business and you're going to have a property and you want to potentially add some of these things on your site. There's maybe some tax abatement available to you. Looking at some of these other ones, increase property value. Again, as you add these amenity features into it and make it part of your development, it potentially raises the value of the home. So again, as a developer, you might be able to sell the price at the home at a premium price. Likewise, those property values, you've increased it. Potentially, there's an increase in tax for the local city and school district. And then finally, multifunction and more space. We came across one project in apartments that is as an example here for more space. Wasn't going to be viable because of the size of the detention versus the property. Putting in some green infrastructure and lid practices allowed them to shrink up their detention basin, allowed for an additional building, and made the project viable. Likewise, multifunctional, if we have park spaces and bioswales and a lot of green, that forest cover that Justin was talking about in part of your property. Again, people are interested in having hiking trails, biking trails, walking trails, those kinds of things. Again, so these things can be multifunctional. Resources, again, this is really the focus of this talk, is that we do have a website that contains all this information. We'd love for you to pull that information off and make use of it in your discussions around your city or your local community. There's a regional guidebook that we created a few years back that has all of this from the very beginning in terms of the various types of projects and things like that, types of methods and things that you can use. And then workshops, we hold workshops whenever we have funding to do so, and on projects to report out on. So we look for opportunities to provide workshops and technical assistance to get the word out and encourage these practices to be used more. Looking into that design for impact, that guidebook that I was mentioning just a minute ago, just opening it up. It has, again, a lid overview, kind of what I'm doing here today, giving you a broad sense of what a lid or green infrastructure is. It talks about those barriers that traditionally we hear of why you wouldn't do green infrastructure, and solutions of how to get around some of those common barriers and keep that discussion going. Let's say several best practices. Again, the review I just gave you on the various different types of things, methods that are out there. Again, not all of them fit for your property, but maybe some of them do. And so it gives a list of what their benefits are and some of their maintenance costs, things like that. There's also a cost benefit analysis. It looks at lid versus a conventional design and why lid could potentially be the right choice. And then some local case studies. The green infrastructure has been put in the Houston region. I'll show you an online mapping tool here in just a second. of the various number of projects. But we really focused in on a variety of projects that run the gambit, from apartment homes to government buildings to parks and open spaces and roadways. And so you give some case studies on a variety of topic of areas. Looking at, again, case studies, just to be real brief on this. Oftentimes that detention basin, at least in the past, I know more recent developments have really started to try to incorporate their detention basins and park space into the thing and make it more part of it. Which is, looking at the traditional process was to put that detention basin in the back and have it fenced off and not really be a usable piece of the property. Now you bring it into the center, you make it a focal piece, you make trails going around it. It still functions as your detention. You then bring a lot of the drainage through swales and other vegetative cover. You might have a medium bioswale. Again, it all drains into the center core, but again, it runs through the property. And oftentimes you'll see trails run through all these various features. And so again, trying to incorporate multi-use all at the same time, trying to help alleviate some of the flooding issues and some of the water quality concerns. I'm not going to cover all the things that are on the slide, but just know that, again, this is in that guidebook. It really talks about the regulatory vehicles that kind of prevent, whether it's the minimum width requirements in a lot of planning departments or curb and gutter requirements that kind of prevent the flexible use of some of these tools. And then there's a perceptual. Again, I mentioned the clay soils as a common reason for folks saying they don't work. But you just have to potentially think of it in a different way, or potentially look at an engineering solution to it. Mentioned the web page. We have a web page that has, again, that design guidebook, but also has other resources, other literature resources available to look at, along with some photographs of these various practices, and then an interactive mapping tool, the one that I'm showing you on the slide. So if you are interested in residential or commercial or mixed use or open space or street improvement, there are buttons within the greater Houston area for various projects that have been put in place. And so you might locate where you're living and find one of these nearby and go visit it and see how it's doing. Again, you can visit it through our interactive webpage as well. And you'll see, in this case, the Girardi Water Smart Park at League City, Texas. You'll get that background mapping feature in terms of where it's located, but you'll also get a description of the project, what was put in to facilitate this. In this case, this park has multiple lid elements to encourage the citizens of League City to visit the park to see them in practice, whether it's a green roof, or it's a cistern, or it's permeable pavers or swales. Again, a project that is certainly easy to go visit and view. And then finally, just to know what we're going to be doing next with regards to lid and green infrastructure, we're going to be conducting an efficacy study, looking at some of the projects that are out there that actually were monitored to see what type of results in terms of maybe improved water quality or flood reduction, and be able to evaluate them and hopefully make recommendations. Our goal, of course, is to try to encourage more of these practices to be in use, try to overcome those barriers. Oftentimes the barriers is going to be the dollar assigned to them. And I've tried to talk about some of the reasons why they may be more cost effective. But again, looking at them in practice, do they work, and be able to recommend those. Of course, out of this, looking at future workshops to be part of this project, but in addition, looking for funding to assist with that too. With that, I'll take some questions.
Stephen, we did have one question in the chat. Oh, sorry.
Okay, and I was going to say also, Todd just lost his power, so it's cycling through. But sure, go ahead with the question.
Okay, so the question is that lid guide only available online, or are copies available?
Well, we currently have a few copies left. I'd say we're probably under 20. So it may be some time for us to try to do a reprint of some form or fashion. We have actually done some upgrades to our print shop, so we may be able to do that if you contact me and give me an idea of the number you might need. But yes, it also is printable online too.
I don't see any more questions in the chat.
All right. And I guess I'll serve for Todd, and we'll set up the stage for the next presenter, and that is Jessica Cias with her project. Go ahead, Jessica.
All right. Well, I am actually near Todd, where he lives, so I'm gonna hope that everything runs smoothly during this presentation. Let's see.
I think I just turned off your video for some reason.
Yeah, I had something to pop up, but that's okay. And let's reshare. Okay. All right. So good afternoon. My name is Jessica Cias, and I am a planner with H-GAC. Today, I'm going to be going over the Bacteria Targeted Monitoring Project. So this project is modeled after the Bacteria Implementation Group, or the BIG's Top 5 Least 5, which was conducted in 2017. Similar to that project, our team and its partners investigated areas within our region to identify bacteria sources. Next slide. Okay. All right, so our region's most prevalent pollutant is bacteria. We estimate that nearly 80% of the region's streams fail to meet the state water quality standard for contact recreation. And for us, that's 126 MPN, or most probable number, per 100 milliliters. So the red features that you see on the map indicate where impairments exist, or bacteria impairments exist. And then the yellow features indicate where there are at least concerns for bacteria. Next slide. So the goal for this project is to identify sources of bacteria and then report those findings to the proper authorities. For this project, we really aimed at investigating 4 waterways that are within a urbanized type of environment, 4 that are within a suburban environment, and then 2 waterways that are within a rural type of environment. Next slide, please. All right, so in order to monitor the progress of the project, we split it into 3 phases. So phase 1 was really our initial data analysis component, where we first identified all the impairments that existed within our region. And then we also wanted to draft the priority areas and present them to a work group where additional discussions were additional evaluations were made. And then we also conducted some discussions about each one of them. So during phase 2, H-GAC, along with its partners, conducted windshield surveys and also field investigation surveys of each waterway that we had prioritized. And then phase 3 was the ultimate report documentation of all of the findings for each one of those 10 selected waterways. Next slide, please. So in phase 1, what we wanted to do was gather that prioritized list. So we looked at the most recent 7-year period of data that we had, calculated the geo mean, and then we broke down the list into those different types of settings that we wanted to really investigate. So we selected 4 within an urban, 4 suburban, and then 2 within that rural. And then again, that list was recommended to a work group, which was then further discussed. If you can go to the next slide. Yeah, so I'm going to break down this table a little bit for you. So the first 4 that you see, Bentliff, a tributary of White Oak Bayou, Mimosa, and also a tributary of Greens Bayou. Those were our highly urbanized type of environments. The remaining 4 that you see going down that list, White Oak, a tributary of Gum Bayou, Mustang Bayou, and Robinson Bayou. Those we indicated as being in a suburban type of environment. And then the last 2, which are further down south in our region, Dickinson Bayou, and then an adjacent tributary to that bayou, Cedar Creek, are the ones that we selected as being in that rural setting. So the geo means, as you can see, especially in that very first one, Bentliff Ditch, its geo mean was actually 24 times greater than the standard for our state level. But when selecting these lists, not only did we select just based upon what type of environment it was in, or based upon what the actual geo means indicated, we also needed to ensure that feasibility was a big factor. So if you look at the assessment unit, the length, we really didn't choose anything that was greater than about 5 miles. We thought that that was enough of a field crew to go and assess. Next slide. Okay, again, so here were those 10 assessment units. They're mapped for you. You can see that 4 of those assessment units are primarily within the city of Houston boundary. There's, with the exception of Greens Bayou, some portions of it do lie outside of their boundary. Robinson Bayou and Cedar Creek are mostly within, they're down south, mostly within the city of League City. Gun Bayou, mostly within Dickinson City. Mustang Bayou does flow through the city of Alvin. And then if we look far up north of White Oak Creek, that's within the city of Conroe. And then there's one that's not listed, and that's simply because Dickinson Bayou, which is, even though it's adjacent to Cedar Creek, which I mentioned is in League City, ironically, the assessment unit part lies outside of any city boundary. Next slide. All right, so during phase 2 is where we did most of our intense work. We first did a reconnaissance of the desktop review. So we wanted to know what was in the watershed, how many outfalls, how many systems, on-site sewage systems were really attributed to that area. And so we first did a windshield survey where samples were collected at major road crossings. Not only did we just collect those samples, but we also noted any potential sources of bacteria, which we would then follow up and really investigate. So the second part of phase 2 is a field investigation. And that particular investigation had a little bit of criteria. So we only really wanted to sample during dry weather conditions. So just ensuring that stormwater was not going to be a concern. Pipes, this investigation was really split into 2 types of sample grabs. So pipes that we considered as permitted, which was anything greater than about 12 inches in diameter, those were collected not at the source, but just downstream and then also just upstream of the flowing pipe. And then those that we considered as unpermitted pipes, or anything less than 12 inches of diameter, or really any flowing tributary to the receiving water, those were only sampled once. And they were sampled directly at the source or upstream of the tributary, so that we ensured that there was no mixing with the receiving water. And then these grab samples were treated just as professional monitoring, and they were analyzed by an accredited lab. Next slide. All right, so this project is currently in phase 3, where reports have been drafted, and we are setting them up to be sent to the local authorities. Recommendations will also be provided to the bacteria implementation group, and then we anticipate working with the appropriate jurisdictions in order to implement those bacteria reduction measures, so that hopefully we can follow up with some investigations as needed to see how successful this project has been. Next slide. All right, so you have a little bit of the progress, but so the windshield investigations, which I had discussed, they were conducted between January and March of this year, followed up by field investigations between March and April. With some of those field investigations, we were alerted to a few problem areas within some of the assessment units that were monitored early on. And so we were able to start the conversations with the city of Houston and also the city of League City, some that we knew that were going to be referred to them with the wrap up of the reports. As of yesterday, I'm happy to say that the reports have been approved by TCEQ. Next slide. All right, so I'm not really going to jump into all of the major findings of each one of these because it would be a lot to go over. However, I'm going to give you a brief snapshot of what we found. So the field crews in total collected about 343 samples and found 52 sites, which we suggested as referral sites. So as expected, that really high number, our first priority area, Bentliff Ditch, which was above 24 times greater than the standard, we found that there was about 8 sites which could be referred for remediation. Over half of the samples collected in that waterway had extreme high levels of bacteria, high enough to where the lab methods used, it was over the detection limit. So I'd say about, I think it was, if I'm thinking about the numbers, I think it was about 80% of all the samples were just extremely high. However, in other cases, some of these referrals really are going to be due to failing infrastructure. We had the University of Houston, the Clear Lake campus, Environmental Institute of Houston. They conducted 9 of the investigations, and they found areas where a permitted pipe or some type of infrastructure type of system, it was completely failing. Either it had completely collapsed and broken in on itself, or was spewing and leaking some of the material directly into the assessment unit. Next slide. In most cases, we found that CRP monitoring, which is usually just conducted once or quarterly at just one station along the assessment unit, it did actually give us a good representation of the bacterial levels that we found during the windshield and field investigations. So many of these waterways had, viewing it spatially, they had high levels of bacteria from the segments that we monitored, so from upstream to downstream. Most of the assessment units included in the project had a majority of their samples collected with bacteria levels greater than the state standard. For example, in those urbanized areas, we saw anywhere from about 23% to 93% of all samples collected. They were just extreme levels of bacteria, high levels of bacteria. And then particularly down at the very bottom, Cedar Creek, it was one of our rural waterways that we investigated. Actually, all of its samples had high levels of bacteria above that state standard. So a handful of these assessment units are recommended for additional field investigations, as some of the sources simply just couldn't be located within that first field investigation. These include the White Oak Creek up in Conroe, and then an unnamed tributary of White Oak Bayou in Houston. Others, such as Bentliff and then also Cedar Creek, they are recommended for additional investigations, as we believe some of the actual bacteria sources, they weren't exactly present in the areas that we had assessed, but are most likely found upstream of the waters and are just being shown in the assessment unit length that we actually monitored. Next slide. All right, so that is really going to be my wrap up on the project. I did see in the chat that there was, if these reports are available, and I am happy to say that I've been working with the H-GAC team in order to make these reports available before this meeting. So I had just received approval yesterday from TCEQ that we are good to go. So those are found under the Water Resources publication page. So now we start the fun and rigorous process of contacting all the local authorities for those particular areas and elaborating and giving them some detailed information about some of the problem areas that we saw. If you have any other questions that you can think of, or any particular interest in at least one or more of these waterways which I discussed, please reach out to me. I'm happy to either give you a little bit more information about some of those reports, or if you have any questions now, if we have time, I think we do, I am also happy to answer any.
Jesse, we have 2 questions in the chat. And first, a significant number of impaired streams flow into Lake Houston, a water source for the city. Should these impaired streams be prioritized for similar studies?
Well, we are in discussion of doing a follow-up type of investigation. We will most likely be including other streams that we can assess, because, you know, we do think that this project is successful because we were able to identify quite a few failing infrastructures that can be remediated. So adding those that are a drinking water source, I think, is going to be essential as well. So yes.
Okay, we have another question in the chat, or maybe it's another comment about the San Bernard Watershed Protection Plan and some missed opportunities to look at some wastewater treatment plants. And I think that might be a larger question for a conversation.
Okay.
I don't know.
I'm happy to follow up with that, with the comment. I'll check my chat box after this to see who inquired or who has that initial response, and I will follow up.
Okay. I don't see. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Todd.
Thanks. So I'm back. The intense thunderstorm seems to have passed. So I just want to thank all of you for attending today, the CWI. I hope this information has been beneficial for you, and that we, can follow up and answer any questions that you might have. One thing to note, you will be receiving a post-workshop survey. I know many of you contributed to the survey that went out before the CWI. Please take a look at it and spend the time to fill that out if you would. We really appreciate the feedback we get from those and kind of know where people are at. But now we'd like to move into our breakout sessions. So you were put into the breakout sessions that you indicated an interest in when you registered. And if you didn't indicate a preference, you've been put in to the session that is covering the watershed that is closest to you. And some of you will be going to the Cotton Bayou implementation plan session, and others will be going to the Big Creek I-Plan session. The rest of you will remain in this room and get an overview of the TMDL I-Plans and WPPs in the region. So once you get into your breakout session, there will be about a 5-minute break. We'll give you a chance to take a little break and then come back, and we'll start those breakout sessions. And we will not all be coming back together. You will leave this meeting from those sessions. So again, thank you very much for your time today. We appreciate it.
And Todd, let me know when you're ready for me to start.
Yeah, I think you're good to go.
Get my video up. All right, welcome back from the break. We've all had a chance to get a drink of water or whatnot. Again, I'm Stephen Johnston, Senior Planner here at the Houston-Galveston Area Council. We're going to go a little bit deeper dive into watershed-based planning. As Todd threw up the slide of all the projects that we have that are ongoing. So there's a lot that's to talk about with regards to watershed-based planning. And so we'll cover that here in this session. Up first, I just want to acknowledge we're our funding partners. We do get funding for total maximum daily load projects, as well as these watershed protection plan projects from both the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality's total maximum daily load program out of Austin, as well as their 319 non-point source program. Additionally, we do sometimes get funding from the Texas State Soil Water Conservation Board. There's 319 non-point source program out of Temple. And I probably should have placed on here as well. TCQ has a program here locally called the Galveston Bay Estuary Program, and we oftentimes get funding from them as well. I just want to throw a mention to them too. Those afterthought for not putting them on here as well, just to let you know where we get a lot of our funding. Additionally, I want to let you know, as we're talking about these various projects, keep in mind that if there is a plan in place in a watershed that you like to call home, and you know organizations that are interested in protecting that watershed, you can use that plan. It doesn't have to come from HGAC. You can use that plan yourself and reach out to TCQ's 319 or the State Soil Water Conservation Board's 319 program and apply. There's a competitive process that usually come out in the summer for both those programs, and you can apply for that. Same thing with the Galveston Bay Estuary program funding. They have funding that they often apply to try to address water quality, one of their missions, and so you're able to apply for that too. So bear that in mind as we're talking about these various watershed protection plans or implementation plans, and consider that, because it doesn't have to be just the Houston-Galveston Area Council that applies. You can be a local government, you can be a nonprofit. Again, there's some financial considerations to be made with that, but just to bear that in mind as we go forward through this presentation. Water quality management in the state of Texas usually takes on 3 forms or 3 phases. Todd kind of had a slide there looking at the Clean Rivers program. And so that program, along with the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, is the main backbone of the monitoring that's done in the state of Texas. The state of Texas does monitoring of the state's waters because the Clean Water Act and EPA require them to be assessed, the waters to be assessed for certain water quality standards, standards that are related to public health, for drinking water and fish tissue. Think of things like PCBs and dioxins in fish tissue for some of the consumption advisories that are in Galveston Bay for that matter. Contact recreation standards for elevated levels of fecal bacteria in waters. Aquatic life use standards based on dissolved oxygen levels, nutrients, chlorophyll A, and habitat, and then nuisance standards for smells and for litter. And so the state monitors those waters, and that monitoring all goes in, and the state assesses that information and produces a report every 2 years called the Texas Integrated Report. And we're currently on the year 2020 integrated report, and we're about to actually move into the 2022 timeframe for the next one. Once they evaluate and assess that information, they will determine if a water body doesn't meet standards. And if it doesn't meet standards, the Clean Water Act requires the state to therefore then address that impairment, typically through a couple of different methods. One of them might be there needs to be additional monitoring. So you might go out and monitor the watershed a little bit more, get more information to better judge that impairment. You might consider a change in the water body's use. So maybe the water body is misclassified and the standard's wrong. And so you might be able to do a use sustainability analysis and verify the standard's correct or not. And then what we're going to talk about mostly today is a pollutant reduction plan, a plan like a watershed-based plan, TMDL implementation plan, or watershed protection plan that would be used to look at how we might reduce that pollutant load through a variety of management measures and get down to hopefully the standard at some point. I mentioned the integrated report, but additionally, H-GAC also produces a report based on that Clean Rivers data. Annually, there's a basin highlights report that typically focus on particular basins of interest for that time frame. But then every 5 years, there is a basin summary report that looks at the entire Clean Rivers basins that are in the HJC's area and reports on the water quality of those basins. So that's produced every 5 years, and actually we're just about to finish up this last 5 year, and so we'll be having that out as an interactive layer. I don't know, Todd, you might put in the chat when that's going to be, or when you think that's going to be, so folks might get an idea of when to check back in with us. Looking at the watershed-based planning, again, there's two basic types of watershed-based plans that are happening in the state of Texas. One of those is through the Total Maximum Daily Load program. This is usually tied to an impairment. In the Total Maximum Daily Load program is required in a certain time frame to initiate a TMDL. Essentially, a TMDL essentially looks at the water body, looks at the monitoring data, and tries to determine how much of that pollutant can go into that water body and still meet a standard, and that sets the total maximum daily load. It's based on this equation where waste load allocations, the permitted sources of that pollutant. So it might be, in the case of a bacterial reduction, it might be looking at the wastewater permits. The load allocation, or LA term, is those non-point sources that are in the watershed, such as cattle, in case of bacteria, maybe pet waste or that kind of thing. Future growth is tied really to that population growth and the infrastructure needed to support that future growth, particularly wastewater. And then there's a margin of safety term that just really kind of allows us to understand that, hey, we don't know everything about this watershed. There are some uncertainties, and so there's a margin of safety to help alleviate some of that uncertainty. After the TMDL is set, then there's an implementation plan that's developed, working with stakeholders to address that pollutant. And TMDLs typically focus on one pollutant at any given time. And so that's the main driver of the implementation plan. A watershed protection plan follows a similar pathway in terms of trying to study the watershed, look at the pollutant of interest, and it can sometimes be pollutants of interest. It can sometimes be multiple water quality concerns, but in addition, there could be other concerns that stakeholders want to talk about, dredging and those kinds of things. And so watershed protection plan is often considered sometimes broader, but again, sort of still follows that process of identifying and then finding resolution to those challenges or problems. They kind of follow this diagram. Again, you characterize the watershed, you try to estimate pollutant reductions, you develop a watershed-based plan to types of strategies and funding and those kinds of things that would go into reducing that reduction amount. Finally, you make it into plan implementation, and then you're going to assess results of implementation to see how you're doing. And sometimes you might go back to the plan and update it. It's called adaptive management in that process, where you're kind of trying to make things a little bit better, or more importantly, better at reducing bacteria in the case of bacteria reduction plan. The key point in the center of this is the stakeholder engagement. Again, these are voluntary plans, whether it's a TMDL implementation plan or a watershed protection plan, they're voluntary. So we like to make the management measures that are put in that plan, or hopefully those are that the stakeholders are engaged in and feel comfortable implementing themselves. Again, there's not always an active partner on the implementation plan, so sometimes it's a requirement that hopefully the locals, those that live, work, and play in that watershed, are engaged in trying to actively implement the plan. And we've talked about the implementation HJC does, and so even if we're not funded specifically for that watershed, we're going to be working in that area just because you're part of our planning area, those 13 counties. And so we'll be implementing regardless of whether we have funds specifically for that watershed. So these are those watersheds. Again, you saw this map that Todd had put up. Again, there are 23 of these in our watershed, whether they're watershed protection plans or implementation plans. 23 in various stages. Many of them are completed. There are also many in progress in terms of developing their plan. So for instance, here the bacteria implementation group, this large outlined area, we've been in implementation for almost 10 years when the plan was approved back in 2013. And then we have other ones that just got approved, like Cypress Creek Watershed Protection Plan. I think the key point, and I go back to what I said earlier, regardless of whether we're in these watersheds. If you live in a work and play, once the plan is done, you can certainly take that plan and write a proposal to the TCQ 319 for implementing a part of that plan. Additionally, if you want to reach out to us and you have a great idea for implementation, we'd love to hear it and be happy to partner with you on implementation. Additionally, it's not just HGAC that has plans in here. Todd mentioned that we have some partners that work in this area too. So Double Bayou, the Houston Advanced Research Center put that plan together. The Upper Gulf Coast Oyster Waters TMDL, that was put together by the Galveston Bay Foundation, and they're stewards of that program. And then Highland Bayou Watershed Protection Plan, as well as Dickinson Bayou, Texas AgriLife, as a program that's trying to address those. Additionally, and then I mentioned there's some watersheds where we have completed plans. Bastard Bayou comes to mind. San Bernard River comes to mind. We've tried to get funding for those. We haven't had luck as of yet. We're still trying. But again, just because we haven't had luck doesn't mean that a local partner could put together a project that would really get the TCQ behind it. Again, a TCQ really loves to have the local governments involved and would love to expand the reach. And so if you're a local government and have interest, or a nonprofit they haven't worked with before in the past, looking for new partners, if you have a great idea, I'm sure they'll love to hear it from you. So just want to plug that in. Whether or not we are the active watershed person or group doesn't mean you can't be a player too. And so I just want to make that clear. Water quality impairments. Again, you saw this slide or similar slide from Jesse with the bacteria impairments. And so yes, bacteria impairments are the single largest impairment in our region. And that's why we're trying to address all 13 counties with various watershed protection plans or implementation plans to try to address that. There are some additional impairments or concerns. So there's a fish tissue consumption advisory still in place for portions of Galveston Bay related to PCBs and dioxins. There's a tidal waters, oyster waters for fecal coliform levels that potentially affect recreational oystering. So if you were on a reef and wanting to pull those oysters off the reef, you might be concerned about fecal coliform and elevated levels there. So that there's an impairment for that. Aquatic life concerns. We have several of our streams that have elevated nutrients, 35% of our stream miles. I'm not sure if I had that right. Based on summary report, might change that number on us. I don't have the latest figures, but just in general, 35% of stream miles exceed state screening levels. Dissolved oxygen, another 22% of streams are impaired impaired due to low dissolved oxygen. So again, some other concerns and as well. One thing to keep in mind as we put together these watershed protection plans, implementation plans, the various strategies and measures that are in there oftentimes will carry over and improve some of these other conditions too. So if we're addressing bacteria and are putting a stormwater wetland, oftentimes that's going to remove those nutrients, remove some of those sediments, things like that, and so have an opportunity to clean up the water and address those, again, as other concerns. Covered a little bit of this already. What goes in a watershed-based plan development? Again, it's voluntary entirely. The development of the plan is voluntary. Stakeholders, attendance. Rarely is there a regulatory concern in any of these. So we're trying to get the stakeholders to be a participant in its development and identifying those reduction measures so that there's some investing in the process and as we get the plan completed, hopefully some carryover in terms of implementation down the road. Again, the plan will identify management measures, best practices to be put in place to reduce bacteria, and then it presents itself as a roadmap, including identifying collaborative partners, those that maybe have jurisdiction over the various management measure. Maybe they have a resource agency that oversees some of the funding, and so it identifies funding sources and those kinds of things to kind of plan for and then measure those milestones down the line to see if we're having improvements. I threw up here, these are some of the common types of management measures that you're going to see. You're going to be addressing things like land management initiatives, things like cattle operations, whether it's feral wildlife, pets, and those kinds of things. You're going to try to address that with land management initiatives, maybe doing stormwater wetlands. It may be working with the Texas State Soil Water Conservation Board or Natural Resource Conservation Service out of USDA to put on some kind of management plan for your property if you're a cattle operation. In times protecting the water body by fencing off the water body from the cattle and providing an alternative water source is an example of that. Again, voluntary. It's not something that's required. It's just to be something listed as a potential benefit if they were to be used. Addressing septic systems and on-site sewage facilities. We have presentations today about some of that. Wastewater treatment facility and collection function. Again, there's permits with the state, and so they're supposed to be following their permit. So typically what we do is we try to encourage best practices. We might hold workshops, technical training, encourage the extension agent, extension service out of A&M that looks at some of these water quality and provides training to, again, come out and maybe do a workshop, try to encourage best practices and sometimes upgrades, recommend upgrades for these facilities. Feral hogs are a problem for all of our watersheds, particularly those in the more rural setting. In trying to address it, unlike cattle operations or even dog waste, we're not talking in those cases of removing a head of cattle or dog from the system. Again, we're not advocating that. In feral hogs case, we're actually talking about the removal of feral hogs. They're a nuisance species, a non-native species, and so trying to get them out of the system. Those that are familiar with feral hogs, they know that to maintain a population, there's been studies that suggest you need to remove 50 to 70% of the population just to maintain. So they're a challenge. They can be hunted all year long, but just to get them out is a difficult task. Dog waste is sometimes a part of the stormwater management. Sometimes it's a separate one. Again, we've had pet waste stations installed in various areas like Lake Jackson, Bay City, usually at parks or places where there's a higher density, say at apartment complexes. Again, encouraging a change in terms of how we manage our pets, and trying to change our operations. So we're encouraging pet waste pickup when and where possible. And then stormwater management. Again, there's key components of the permits that a lot of local governments have with the state of Texas in their phase 2 permits, stormwater permits to manage their waters before they get to the state's waters. So looking at impaired waters and trying to address those particular pollutants of concern before they actually reach the state's waters. And so we want to work with those local governments to beef up their systems, beef up their best practices they're using, and so forth. And so those kinds of things are typical, what you'll find in an implementation plan or a watershed protection plan. Again, you sometimes getting down to smaller actions and activities underneath these, but that's a general overview of what you'd find. We've talked a lot about HGAC's implementation. Again, just because we don't have money to work on a particular watershed doesn't mean we don't work there. We often pull things over if we're working on a particular project to include those watersheds too. Whether it's a workshop, we're going to send out the invitation to everyone in a given area, whether your watershed has funding or not, to encourage you to participate. We're going to come, if you invite us to in the case of Olin, take your child to work fair, which is what this picture is. We're going to come out and have a booth and provide some information. So we've covered these. I don't really want to cover those in any greater detail than that, but just to let you know and remind you that we are implementing in your watersheds. We don't want to wait for a plan to get developed. We'll begin implementation as soon as we can, and when we have the ability to do so. I'm going to go into a series of slides to show you some of the things that are happening in the watersheds. Maybe if you've seen the bacteria trend lines for the bacteria implementation group, and I've probably said this a few times to a lot of you, again, just to look at this graph, don't necessarily need to pay attention too much to all the stuff that's around it, just that it's a downward trend for the most part for implementation. Again, the implementation plan came in here, but the three big participants in the development of the TMDL in the early 2000s were the City of Houston, Harris County, and the Harris County Flood Control District. They hold what's called a phase 1 stormwater permit. That permit's been going a lot longer than the phase 2s, and so they have a little bit a longer time frame to address. And so they started way back when we were talking about bacteria and talking about the impairment. They folded into their phase 1 plan a bacteria reduction plan, and they started off the bat trying to address sanitary sewer overflows for aging collection systems. They started to address failing septic systems in on-site sewage facilities in unincorporated parts of the county. They started to look at how detention basins could be altered or improved in future detention basins to address water quality. Again, that's not necessarily the mission of Harris County Flood Control District, but they're part and parcel of the Joint Task Force, and they try to do that when and wherever they possibly can. And so we like to attribute and believe a lot of this reduction is based on their efforts to do that. As we get to these tail ends and it starts to level out, we're trying to figure out what do we got to do next. And so we're actually looking at revising and updating the implementation plan to maybe give us a better sense of direction and target our focus, really trying to encourage those local governments that have phase 2s to come to the table with us and see where we might find some holes and some opportunities. If there's a way for us to look at funding sources, maybe we can find a way to squeeze some additional funding to do some of these projects, similar to what Jesse was talking about for targeted monitoring. We can continue doing that. Exploration Green is one of those projects that really fits into the green infrastructure realm. Again, it's a project that some of our partners are working on down in the Clear Lake area. Again, the Clear Lake Water Authority is the lead on this, and there's multiple partners with them in this project. Texas AgriLife Community Partners is one that comes to mind really quickly. It's received 20 plus awards since it got started in the late 2000s as a concept. It's a prime example of turning a redevelopment of a 170 acre golf course into a green infrastructure project. It's essentially managing 2,000 acres of stormwater. In fact, I get to live in a house that drains into the golf course area. And so they're managing that 2,000 acres of stormwater that runs to this property. And it's through 38 acres of wetlands, 6,000 native trees they're planting. In addition, they're planting prairies and other native species in here for valuable wildlife habitat. There's 6 miles of hike and bike trails. So again, we're looking at amenities and multi-use. And then finally, and probably most importantly, for at least the water authority and those that live there, flood mitigation. So some of the homes had flooded numerous times. And so they've installed essentially 5 detention lakes, removing a tremendous amount of soil to do that. And it has a 500 million gallon capacity once it's finished in sometime year 22 or 2023. And they have plans to monitor some of their features. So that's certainly one of the things we've talked about is, and I mentioned that efficacy project we're going to have, having projects like this that are monitoring water quality and being able to use that to inform decision makers who have the funding first to maybe open it up to do more green infrastructure. Top 5 Lease 5, it's a very similar program. We did this a few years before Jesse's targeted monitoring project. It was really focused on that illicit discharge detection and elimination. That's what IDDE stands for. And to be a model project for a phase 2 city that maybe hasn't done some wet weather and dry weather sampling of their water bodies to try to find sources. So we wanted to provide a model program for folks to look at. Again, it kind of follows that same 3 phases. We had a windshield survey. We had a desktop survey where we tried to identify the water bodies that would best be served by doing some kind of a survey like this. It's called Top 5 Lease 5 because it's based on the bacteria implementation group's definition. They wanted to look at what are those top 10 highest concentration in terms of highest concentration watersheds that are out there that we maybe want to track and follow. And likewise, what are those 10 least, the ones that are closest to the standard, that if we were to watch them and maybe do some work there, we might get them to the standard a lot faster. And so it's based on that and trying to identify water bodies to go and investigate. It also had a rapid bacteria survey. So instead of the rigorous hold times and sending a bacteria to the lab, the first phase really went out and did a rapid assessment to try to determine where you'd want to spend your dollars in the future on a more expensive sampling and monitoring. So then once you identified those areas you want to go back to, do some wet weather and dry weather analysis, collect those data points, and then get it to the lab on time. Out of that, making recommendations. Again, we're not a local jurisdiction. We don't have control over these collection systems, and so we had to notify the local jurisdictions about our findings. Some, opening up manholes and going down some of the collection systems we certainly can't do. It really relies on those jurisdictions to do the final leg of the project. Again, it's all quality assured. We had a quality assured project plan, and it's available on our website as a model program for doing this kind of thing. And again, phase 2 permits require investigation of your collection systems to look for these kinds of things where you might have a potable water break, or you might have holes in your infrastructure. And so again, we want to provide a model program for that. Another one of our partners, the Galveston Bay Foundation, provides an online tool, and I know a lot of cities as well as municipal utility districts provide phone numbers and opportunities for your residents to be able to report. So one of those parts of education is really being able to inform your residents that if you see a blown over silt fence on a construction site, hey, report it. And so the Galveston Bay Action Network is a phone app that you can have on your phone to easily report something that you see out there. I know I've done it in the past when I saw a construction site and a bunch of mud and the like on the cement roadway, and reporting that hey, that's not supposed to be happening. And so again, those reporting tools, making them available. I know the city of Houston has 311, and so making sure your residents know about that as an important action, and again, part of that implementation plan. Finally, and most of you probably have heard me say this before, but just in case there's some of you in the audience that have not seen this, this is where we've been lucky to have both monitoring available to assess, but as well 2 partners that have been doing a large part of heavy lifting to address some of those on-site sewage facilities that are potentially out there failing. It's in Aldine Westfield. I'll just walk you through the map just so you can get an idea where this is actually located. So this is Bush Intercontinental Airport. This is Beltway 8, this is US 59, and this is the Hardy Toll Road. Westfield Estates is in this area too. You heard Brian mention 50% failure rate. So this is an unincorporated part of Harris County. And back in the late 90s, there were some concerns that there were some on-site sewage facilities that maybe weren't functioning properly. You got enforcement and those kinds of things to help you determine that. And so the county, along with the East Aldine Management District, commissioned a study to look at this area and to look at the functionality of these on-site sewage facilities and determine what the best course of action would be going forward. And it turned out that a lot of communities had 30 to 50% failure rates, and so there was some concern because a lot of them were also getting their drinking water from groundwater, and so concerns for health and public safety were present. And so the county and the district got together and pulled funding sources, whether it's community block grants, Texas Water Development Board state revolving fund grants, as well as local bonds, to the tune of about $43 million to date. Because the numbers could change a little bit since this is a few years old, but pulled those dollars together and have hooked up since 2014 at least 846 residential and commercial properties with centralized wastewater. And again, as Brian mentioned, wastewater treatment facilities or on-site sewage facilities, again, if they're functioning correctly, both those types of systems typically don't release untreated or partially treated wastewater. And so if they're failing at 30 to 50%, Harris County really wanted to look and target those areas and try to get some collection system that would work. And again, one of the issues here too was that a lot of the lots had been subdivided to the point where you really can't put in an aerobic system or even a septic system at this point in time. And so looking at alternatives, they've looked at centralized wastewater, and they've essentially abandoned about 1,500 on-site sewage facilities from the region. We were fortunate, and that's why we get to the monitoring portion of this, that we had some stations down below in this area, like this one here on Greens Bayou, and these here on Halls Bayou, to be able to look at the data and see if there's any attributive lowering of bacteria concentrations. And we have found 20% reductions here. If we had more projects like this, again, where we have monitoring and being able to firm up, hey, these things work. Again, that's really the selling point to why, you might go to your local decision maker and say, hey, we really like you to fund these projects because they show some benefit. With that, I think we're running close to being out of time. I'm happy to answer questions related to watershed-based planning processes, as well as either myself or Todd or whoever's on here, answer any of your questions you might still have percolating from the workshop. Give you a chance to ask those before we end the date.
Stephen, there aren't any questions in the chat, but we might be able to let people unmute if they have questions. This isn't a large group anymore.
Sure. Happy to hear them.
Hey, Stephen, Tom Ronayne, how are you?
Good, Tom. How are you doing?
Good. Yeah, I made the comment earlier, and poor Justin's had to listen to me, every so often, whine about, we've had a watershed protection plan for years, and you're unsuccessful this time every year, putting in for grants for the next year's budget. So I guess a couple of comments. There seems to be a philosophy change now, and maybe it's from TCEQ, which affects, what you're willing to spend time on. But there was an absolute refusal to look at wastewater treatment plant discharge points and permit compliance when our watershed protection plan was developed. And when we wanted to understand better what was going on with our bacteria impairment, somewhat just the nature of it, we knew it was intermittent. We suspected it was, flow related, runoff related. And there was very strong pushback about doing any additional monitoring, and almost a quote from H-GAC at the time: "We have plenty of data. We just need to work on reducing the bacteria." Well, of course, here just recently we found out that there's one city that since about 2002 has been discharging almost completely untreated waste into the river. If you try to and we've done this now, we've tried to go back and look at WWTP permits and see what the compliance history is. If it's an industrial commercial permit, it jumps off the computer at you, what their history is. But if you try to find a municipal history, man, the code and the torturous route that you have to go through, it's buried in there. And I don't know if that's anything that a larger group like H-GAC could push back against Texas Municipal League or whoever, has that sway over TCEQ. But it would be nice to be able to for a watershed to be able to look at the discharge points, the permits, and see the compliance. And then where we suspect an issue in other areas, like we know there are two canal neighborhoods with, very tiny home plots and septic systems that are 70 years old. And you can go up there and, on a jet ski or a pirogue, shallow enough draft to get up in there, and the smell just drives you out. We know there are issues in particular areas, but there's been no no sway to do any targeted monitoring in those areas and then try to get those folks some help. So that it sounds like from the program that that was presented today, there is an appetite for doing some of that now, but it also sounds like we're on our own to try to get money to do that. So I guess one question is, you know, is there a grant writing 101 offering from H-GAC or elsewhere? Because some of the things that were found to be best practices and things that are waiting for implementation are agricultural and ranch lands, maintaining the riparian lands, restricting access of cattle to the river and what have you. And I can tell you from the mouth of the river all the way up to 10 or 15 miles above Highway 35, we've seen all that area from the water. There's not a fence or anything, and the further upriver you go, the more often it's fresh, and there are cattle in the river and next to the river all the time. How to even get started on writing a grant or even knowing what to ask for to begin implementing some of those things, it's just beyond our little group to figure that out. So we're kind of grasping at straws here. You know, what do we do to start implementing our watershed protection plan? We've got Ryan Gerlich came down again. Last year was the first year in about 7 years he's missed giving a septic system education program, and he's out among the public again. If you want to advertise that, if your folks are not, we're doing a river cleanup in 3 phases. We've done 2 already this summer, and 1 more will be done this weekend. We did a highway cleanup last weekend. You know, we're doing everything we think we can do, you know, with our own resources. We just need help.
Right. And I take what you're saying. Certainly, there's opportunities for us to sit down with you and other members of your group. And certainly we have had some success in getting awards from 319 program. And we can happy to sit down with you and look at how we can help your grant writing. I think I was trying to make the statement that don't wait for us. Certainly, if you have something that you'd like to try to get through TCQ, there's opportunities. And also TCQ, reaching out to them directly, their non-point source program directly, and saying, hey, here's some things that we're thinking about. Likewise with the state's water conservation board. With regards to pulling permits, yeah, I think we could probably sit down. Let's talk in September about pulling, because we do look at the discharge monitoring reports for all of the region and have that information, so we can look at how their performance of those plants are currently, and certainly be happy to sit down with you and go through those permits with you.
Oh, and you know, what do we need to do to initiate that, or we're on your calendar for September, you'll holler at us, or how does that work?
Yeah, you have initiated it, so we will follow up with you, Tom. You got my promise on that. We'll be looking at helping you out in September. It's a little late for the TCQ funding for 319, but right now the soil board has 319 funding. Again, if you're targeting those agricultural sources, it's an opportunity to try to put in something there. If you know Brian Koch, he actually has a little bit more leeway than TCQ does, and they're talking about project ideas. You can reach out to Brian on some of those things that you'd be interested in trying to see if they'll help fund.
Okay, could you shoot me some contact information?
I sure will.
Okay, and just last ironic comment, this city that we're talking about, you know, they've been fined over the last 20 years, and they at least once or twice have donated to an SEP, but it's for addressing waste tires and not address or not to our SEP, which addresses Justin's trees. You know, we've got an SEP to do a conservation easement for some native hardwood riparian land, you know, further upriver.
Which is awesome. Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, that's just an irony there, that because we did not look at municipal discharge points back when, we have not known about this, and it has been kept very secret by everybody involved. At the very least, we could have said, well, hey, while you're polluting the river, could you at least donate a little to our SEP and let us increase our conservation easement acreage.
Right. Tom, like I said, we'll chat with you some more. And just want to maybe see if we can get some other questions answered before we close up, because we're actually at 4 o'clock. So just want to be able to walk through that. But I really appreciate your comments, Tom.
Thank you.
Any other questions before we close out the session today?
Yes, I just have one.
Go ahead.
We heard about conservation, which I'm in complete agreement with. All trails and have horses going in the river nonstop 7 days a week. And I just don't see how that's conservation. Secondly, I know a lot of ranchers and I own a ranch. And I don't know a single rancher in my area that doesn't fence off the river.
I applaud ranchers that are doing that. I know there are some places where that's not the case.
Cows and horses. Like that, but I'm just saying the ones that I know on Lake Creek, and none of them allow cattle or horses to go into the river. A horse or cow has never gone on the river on our property ever.
And I applaud you for doing that, John. I really do. We do have some other places where that's not the case.
No, I agree. And then the other thing I want to say is this: when you cannot hunt or shoot a gun, that allows to overpopulate, mismanaged. And the hogs are a huge problem. So I would think between the horses and the wild hogs, it's just not really a good idea. And I want to say this too. I've been listening to y'all this whole time, and I commend you. And I think that y'all are doing some really, really good work. And I want to support you any way I can. I've listened to everybody. And I think the work you are doing is amazing. And I'm sincerely appreciate it, because I'm on your side. And I work it bothers me to see trash because here's another thing. I've been around here a long time. And when we used to play as kids, we didn't play with a computer. We went up and down the rivers, up and down the streams. And that's how we swam in the streams, fished ate the food. So I seen things both ways. So I can immediately walk on a river or a stream, and I could immediately tell you the health of the river, the health of the wildlife, without doing any water testing. But I see trash, I see dog waste, I see horses. I can't environment. And then you cut and you put a trail on and you have dogs and horses and parks and buildings. It's
Yeah, John, I think we're losing the connection here a little bit. I know we've talked a little bit by email.
It's hard for me to understand that. Yes,
John, go ahead.
Stephen, if you don't mind. Hi, this is Justin. It sounds like we're losing John a little bit, but I did want to say, I want to thank John for being here. John was a great stakeholder of mine up on our Lake Creek and West Fork project. And he underlines two very important pieces that, we kind of touched on a little earlier. But, he's absolutely correct in pointing out that, like I said, I really think our agricultural producers are often some of the best stewards of our land. They are intimately acquainted with the land, they know the land, and they care about the land. And unfortunately, I think sometimes the finger gets pointed at the ag community by other folks. But I think more importantly, some of the things John was just talking about is, the right practice for the right place. If you have an area that is adjacent to people's working lands, and maybe that's not the best place to put a trail. Maybe that's the best place to find some money for a conservation easement that doesn't allow access. Something that's just setting aside a riparian buffer, but is not changing that use to public. And I think that's something that's throughout all our efforts. Part of our efforts to understand a watershed and work with folks like John, who's been a tremendous value to me, in helping me understand kind of, his neighbors and his operations, is really understanding what place is the best for what practice, so that we're not using a one size fits all. We're really saying this is what's going to be feasible locally. This is what the folks are actually interested in. Let's find resources for that and move forward on that, but with a real respect for what's going on the ground.
That's much better than I could actually say it. And the last thing I want to mention is the threats of eminent domain. You create enemies. And by creating enemies, people aren't going to want to work with y'all. And that's the case now. And I'm not saying nobody here has been unclear about the message, but there has been people in your partnership that have. And when you threaten people with eminent domain, they're thinking, okay, great. Yeah, I spent years paying for this property, not selling the property. And all of a sudden I have people here threatening, wanting to take our property. And it's extremely offensive. It's like getting slapped in the face. So whenever you go to a meeting with ranchers, the topic of the meeting is, oh yeah, here's this group out of Houston. They're planning on taking our property, and it's extremely offensive and it hurts y'all terribly.
And let me just make clear again, these are voluntary plans. There's nothing in any of these plans that talks about eminent domain. And be clear that HGAC doesn't advocate for an eminent domain, at least in the case of the water plans that we're talking about. So just being clear on that.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that, and John points out, sort of maybe the difference, Stephen, before we're talking about, this is what we do, this is what we advocate for, and maybe sometimes what the public perception is. And sometimes that even if there's nothing to that perception, if someone has confused us with another agency, that perception still has weight. And John and I have talked about this a lot, and he's absolutely right that, there's, to some extent, we only have so much control on other people's messages, but it behooves us to make sure we are being very careful with our messaging and very direct with our messaging, so that if there is a messaging or someone's confusing, an eminent domain procedure with one of our projects, we need to be very clear, if that's a concern in that area, that look, this is what we're about, this is what we're not about, and that's not, I'm not drawing value judgments, just so that even if it's not something we're involved in, there isn't that public perception. Because John's right, that when wires get crossed sometimes with perceptions, that has real impacts for whether someone's willing to work for us. And I think that's been a lesson we really took to heart in our West Fork project.
Well, and we'll keep these discussions going. We'll pass the 4 o'clock mark, and so you want to kind of wrap this up today. Let folks know that again, there'll be a survey coming out. Feel free to put comments on that survey about the program that you heard from today, as well as things for the future. And there's some questions on there about what the type of programming you want to see going in the future. So please fill that out and get back with us. And again, you have our contact information. Feel free to reach out to us for any of your questions. We didn't answer them, or how we can coordinate better with y'all on advancing a lot of these projects that we have in our region. So I just want to say again, thank you on behalf of HGAC and on behalf of the water quality staff here at HGAC. We really appreciate your attendance and look forward to furthering our conversations with each of you going forward. Thanks again.